So this is actually two parts. Okay, so what we've been working on is the body of it, but we're actually going to end this part of this body that we've been working on and then create a whole new layer. And that layer is going to involve the 4 colored strings that you got in your basket, in your kit. So I recommend whatever color the string of your basket is, that's the color you start with. So for me, for this one, the color is yellow. So I'm going to start with yellow and put the other ones aside. All right. So we're paying attention to where we started the basket in its very beginning. And we're going to try to line up where we finish the basket with where we started the basket. And the reason that we want to do this is because there's going to be a little bit of an angle on the basket, and we're trying to minimize that angle. I'm going to take off the little piece of straw, and I'm just going to stitch down these pine needles. And not add any more. We're just stitching them down flat to the top. So here is my last stitch. And I'm going to go around that thread and create a knot. So we're going to start a whole new layer. We're going to start by filling the straw again. Okay, so we got pine needles are full. And we're going to give it about an inch before we tie our knot. And we're using the long, there's about 5 meters in each of the 4 colors. So we're going to make sure that there is a long tail on this, on all of the colors of the medicine wheel. And we're going to double knot it. So you can see this is how long the tail is. It's probably half a meter, maybe a bit over a foot. And I am hearing my intuition telling me that that is too short. So I'm just gonna undo these knots and make it just a little bit longer. There we go. So a little bit of tail on the pine needles, and then quite a bit of tail on the other side of the string. So now we're going to come over to the basket, and we're going to take the tail and put the needle onto the tail, and we're going to thread it through this. So we're going through the inside to the outside of where your last stitch was. So now we have the tail from the piece that we used to tie down the top of the basket, and we have the tail that's attached to the pine needles. And the pine needles are on top layer. And we're going to tie these down really tight. As tight as possible. Double knot. Don't break the needles, but really just give it a good tug. Good. So, and pay attention, make sure you know which one is attached to the rest of your thread. It should be longer than the other one, and keep your needle on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to be wrapping this string around these pine needles to create a coil. So we move the pine needles up an inch, like a 3/4, just about an inch. And we take the thread and we're going over and around. Let's do it this way. And then just pushing the coil as tight as you can against the first knot. And again, you don't want to let go at this point for very long. You can let go for a couple minutes or loosen the tension and come back and tighten it. But if you just leave it, everything will become uncoiled. Sometimes I use the straw to hold the coil. So we're there. I'm going to push the straw over the coil to hold it in place. I'm going to come back to the tail, and I got it stitched down this part of the coil. So I take the tail with the needle, go through, try not to make a knot. Okay, so there's one stitch holding it down. There we go. So we've got one stitch holding down the coil. I'm going to come in and do another stitch. You only want to tack down the coil of needles once you've got it covered. So you don't want to jump ahead on this part. So there's two. Right. Pull that tight. Put the tail with the needle in the basket. Check the straw, needs some needles. Slide the straw along, pull this as tight as possible, and then holding the tension, start coiling again. Okay, now I use the straw to hold that coil. Go back to get the needle. You just want to make sure you don't tack down the other string that you're working with. So go to the, so this was our last stitch that we used to hold down the coil, and this will be the next stitch. And we're doing the exact same stitch that we did with the basket. And then just pulling it tight, and we're kind of shaping the pine needles to the ledge. Of the basket. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches holding down the coil. Now, when we're measuring how far to go around the circle, I don't have a careful math for doing that. I really just eyeball it. So I'll take a piece of string or a pine needle that's straight, and I will lay it across the top to help me measure it. So here's the start of the pine needle coil. So I know if I pull that string tight, that's going to be halfway right here. So then I might take a pine needle that's straight and lay it across. So then I can see that there's 4 quadrants. And that kind of gives me an idea to know where I'm going to stop one of the quadrants and start the next one. So I know it's around here somewhere, and I'll check again when I get closer. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stitches, 9 stitches to go. So everyone's got different teachings about which colors of the medicine wheel go in which order. Mine are yellow, red, black, and white. And so I'm going to move on to the red thread now. And just the same way that we created the knot when we were adding string onto the basket, we're going to create a knot the same way. So make sure you have a nice long tail. You're going to wrap that tail around the yellow string. Tie a knot, and then push that knot as far down the yellow thread as possible. You have the scissors. we are going to cut the yellow thread. Still have a lot left over, that's totally okay. Right, so we've got the red thread tied around the yellow thread. We'll take the tail of the red thread and the leftover yellow and tie them together. You want to leave a long tail because that's how we pin it down. So there's our knot. We're going to take our needle and put the needle through the knot. Put the needle through the knot. Pull it tight on the needle. Pull the needle out. Pull the two strings tight. So now we have red tail, red coiling, and we're going to go for it. There's 4 stitches holding down the red. Good job. Okay, so we're just going to measure quickly. So with the string from where we started, we're going to go halfway across. So we've got about till there. About till there before we're halfway around the circle. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5, and about an inch and a bit. Okay, so we have finished the red quarter of the basket. Now we're moving on to the black. So again, we've got the red coil, the red tail here. So this is what we're using to stitch down the sides. We're going to take the black. Make sure we get a nice long tail. Tie it around the red string. Tie the black and red string together. Use the needle through the knot. Pull the knot tight. Take the needle out, pull the strings, and there's our next one. So I'm going to cut this. Tying the two red strings together. Should have done that with the yellow as well. Didn't, but we will. And then when you are done with the 1/4 of the basket, the strings will be on the inside. But if you want to hang beads off the side, the way I did with this one, what you're going to do is take your needle so both strings through the needle eye, and then you're just going to go back through the spot where the strings are, pull them to the outside of the basket, and there's the strings, and you can hang beads or whatever you would like off of those strings. And it kind of gets them out of the way as well, because when they're inside the basket, they can interfere with your weaving. So our red strings on the outside, yellow strings on the outside, our black string is attached. Now we're going to coil it out. So when we get to this point, we're going to pay attention to the length of the pine needles on this side and the pine needles here. So when we get to this point where the two cross over, we're going to be trying to weave them all together at once. So I'm just going to quickly get to about here, and then I will start weaving them together. Okay, so I'm just going to tie, I'm using the yellow thread that I originally had when I started the top ring, and I'm just going to use it to tie just loosely the top, the end of the pine needles to the start of the pine needles. So we're just creating one complete ring. Oh, yeah. So I've just kind of got the two ends pinned together with a yellow thread. And now I'm going to continue wrapping with the white thread and a needle, because I got to go under and around. So now I've tied knots around the two ends, and I'm holding that string underneath just to try and maintain the tension while I am looping around the pine needles. Now I'm getting knots in my string, and that's usually when I start getting a bunch of knots and mess and stuff like that, that's usually my cue to stop. That's usually how I know I'm tired. And when I start making little mistakes all over the place, I should probably just take a rest.